The laughter started before Sorvan even finished his second sentence. I heard it ripple through the chamber in waves, species by species, as the translation matrices pushed his words into 400 different auditory formats. Some of the beings around me made sounds like grinding stone. Others produced something between a hiss and a whistle. A few simply flashed rapid patterns across their skin in colors that my implant told me meant amusement. All of it, every strange and alien expression of it, meant the same thing. They were laughing at us, at me, at the 12 billion people I was standing there to represent. I kept my face completely still. That was something my mentor, a retired diplomat named Edward Cross, had drilled into me over 5 years of preparation. He used to say that the face is the only thing you can fully control in a room you do not own, so you should control it absolutely. I had practiced that stillness in mirrors, and in difficult meetings, and in the long, cold silences that come when you are the only human in a room full of beings who have decided your species is beneath serious consideration. I had become very good at it. I needed every bit of that practice in that moment. I had been in the Grand Concordat Assembly of Nexus Fael for 6 hours before the vote was called. 6 hours of procedural speeches, registration protocols, and the routine business of subverting body that had been running for 4,000 years without interruption. I had watched species with names I could barely pronounce vote on trade routes and territorial boundaries and resource-sharing frameworks that touched not one corner of human space. I had sat in the observer's gallery for years attending these sessions through a screen, but this was the first time I had been permitted to stand on the floor itself. Earth's third formal application for full membership. Our last allowed under Concordat law. After this the door closed permanently, and we would remain what we had been for 80 years. An observed provisional species, permitted to watch the decisions being made about the galaxy, without any right to participate in them. 72 days of preparation had brought me to this room. I had memorized every counter-argument that our advisory team thought Archlegate Sorvan might raise. I had practiced my formal statement in 9 languages. I had studied the voting history of every member species, and identified the 12 most likely to be persuadable if the initial count ran against us. I had even memorized the correct pronunciation of Sorvan's full name and title, which required the human throat to do something it was not designed for, and which I had practiced in the shower every morning for 3 weeks. None of that preparation covered what he actually did. Archlegate Sorvan of the Vethara Dominion was tall, even by Vethara standards. He had 4 upper limbs, each one ending in a narrow, precise arrangement of articulated fingers, and a face that looked, to human eyes, like someone had stretched a pale membrane over a geometry problem. His species had been founding members of the Concordat. 4,000 years. They had helped write the original charter, and in the time since, they had risen to a position of influence within the assembly that was not formally acknowledged, but was understood by everyone who had ever sat in that room for more than an hour. When Sorvan rose to deliver the Dominion's formal rebuttal to Earth's application, the chamber went quiet the way it only went quiet for him. He began with data. I had read his previous speeches and I had expected that. He always began with data. He was methodical and he was precise. And he understood that the most effective arguments are the ones that cannot be disputed, because they are true. He listed Earth's recorded history of armed conflict between nation-states, spanning 12,000 years of documented human civilization. He cited the total number of species that had existed on our planet and no longer did, eliminated directly or indirectly by human activity. He spent a full 4 minutes on the 200-year period in the 21st and 22nd centuries, during which our own environmental systems had come within a calculable margin of irreversible collapse. Every figure was accurate. Our own historical databases contained every number he was reading. I could not argue a single one. Then he paused. The chamber was completely still. 400 species waiting. He looked directly at me. It was the first time during the entire session that he had done so, and it was deliberate. He wanted me to understand that what came next was addressed specifically to me, not to the chamber. He said, in a tone that carried no cruelty because it required none, that granting Earth a seat in the Concordat Assembly would be, in his measured and considered assessment, comparable to handing a powerful weapon to a child who had not yet learned to walk without falling over. He said it precisely. He said it clearly. He did not raise his voice or use any of the rhetorical devices that lesser speakers relied on for emphasis. He simply said it, in the way that people say things when they are completely certain that they are right. The laughter came then. All of it, from all directions, in all its strange and varied forms. The grinding stone sound and the hiss whistle and the skin patterns and a dozen other. Expressions of amusement that I had no word for, filling the chamber from every tier, from every corner, from 387 different species experiencing the same shared joke at the same moment. He continued over the laughter. His voice perfectly level, he added that humanity's period of provisional observation had been, if anything, a generous extension of patience on the Concordat's part, and that the organization's willingness to allow 3 formal applications over 80 years spoke to a deep and principled commitment to fairness, even in cases where the applicant in question had done very little to merit such consideration. I stood at the speaker's position and I listened to every word. My implant was recording everything at full fidelity. I did not need it to. I was going to remember every syllable without assistance. I was going to remember the exact quality of the laughter. I was going to remember the way Sorvan's voice did not change at all while he delivered his opinion, the complete and total absence of hesitation or doubt, the ease of a being who had never needed to consider the possibility that the thing he was saying might matter to the person he was saying it about. That was the detail that stayed with me above all others, not the vote that came after, not the specific words, the ease. When the session moderator called the vote, it took very little time. 387 member species voted against Earth's admission to the Concordat. One species, a quiet, precise group called the Aethani, who I had spoken with briefly the previous morning over a shared language relay, chose to abstain. No member voted in favor. There was no one to vote in favor. Earth was not yet a member, so I had no vote of my own, and the single ally we might have hoped for had decided that uncertainty was a better position than commitment. 387. One abstention, 0. The moderator asked if I had any closing remarks. I said yes. I kept them brief. I thanked the chamber for its time, acknowledged the result formally as required by procedure, and noted that Earth's delegation would be reviewing its existing relationship with the Concordat in light of the session's outcome. I used careful diplomatic language, the kind that means a great deal if you know how to read it and means nothing if you don't. Most of the 400 species in that room were not listening carefully enough to know how to read it. They had already moved on mentally to the next item on the agenda. I walked toward the exit corridor, past rows of alien delegates in their designated environmental tiers, past the hum of the translation matrices and the particular smell of 17 atmospheres blended into something breathable but wrong, past the accumulated presence of 4,000 years of organized galactic civilization that had looked at humanity and decided, one more time, that we were not worth the trouble. I passed close to where Sorvan was standing near his delegation's tier, already in conversation with 2 of his staff, already attending to whatever came next in his schedule. He was not looking at me. He did not need to. As far as he was concerned, the matter was settled and I was already behind him. I stopped walking. Not for long. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Long enough to make it deliberate. He noticed because he was perceptive and he looked at me. I let him see my face. Not angry, not defeated, not performing strength for an audience. I was simply looking at him the way you look at something you want to remember exactly. His face, the position of his 4 arms, the environmental tier behind him with the soft blue light his species required. The way this moment felt. I wanted to remember all of it. Then I walked out. The corridor outside the main chamber was made of material that looked like white marble, but was always precisely warm to the touch, heated by systems buried in Nexus Vale's infrastructure. The station was extraordinary in its scale, built over 6 centuries, expanded and rearranged so many times that its own architects could no longer agree on its total volume. It orbited a dim orange star that no one had given a human name, because until very recently we had not been permitted to operate vessels in this region of space at all. My aide, a young man named Owen Clark who had been with the diplomatic office for 3 years and still managed to look genuinely surprised by things, fell into step beside me without a word. He had been watching from the observer's position on the tier above and he had seen everything. I could tell by the way he was walking, carefully controlled, the way people walk when they are managing something they do not yet want to put into words. Ambassador, he said quietly. Not ambassador, I said. Delegate. They never gave me the title. He was quiet. We walked through the warm corridor together. Our footsteps were the only human sounds in that space. Are you all right? He asked. I considered the question. The corridor was nearly empty at this end. The session behind us was already continuing, already moving to the next item, as if we had never been there at all. I'm fine, Owen, I said. I need you to pull the full transmission log and confirm the recording is clean. The entire session, from the moment Sorvan stood to deliver the rebuttal. He looked at me sideways. For the official report? For the transmission home, I said. Full broadcast quality, every word, every sound. He understood what I meant by every sound. That's going to land very badly. Yes, I said. Make sure the signal is clean. We walked the rest of the way to the docking bay in silence. The ship waiting for us was a diplomatic shuttle called the Meridian, small and comfortable, and painted in the blue and white that Earth used for its Concordat representation. I had always thought those colors were too much like a hand raised in a room where no one was planning to call on you. I stepped aboard and took the forward seat. Through the viewport, I could see the outer shell of Nexus Vale, its docking rings and communication arrays and observation platforms, all of it built by civilizations that had looked at us across 8 decades and decided we were not ready. I looked at it for a long time, then I looked away. Owen appeared in the doorway with the confirmation that the recording was clean and ready. Send it, I said. He sent it. The Meridian's engines came up. We moved out through the departure corridor and into open space, and I watched the station shrink to a point, and then it was just another bright light among the stars, indistinguishable from any other, and I was going home. I did not sleep. I sat with a cup of tea that went cold, and I thought about 12 billion people who were about to hear those sounds, all of those strange and varied expressions of amusement from 400 species, translated into every human language, played through every speaker and screen on every inhabited surface of our world. I thought about what that would feel like. I thought about the ease in Sorvan's voice, and I thought about whether it would land the same way for them as it had for me, and I thought that it probably would, and that it probably should. We were 14 hours from Nexus Vale when Owen came back to the cabin with a data tablet and a face that had changed. He looked like someone who had just read something that required a moment to fully understand. There's a message from home, he said. He handed me the tablet. The message was from the Secretary General's office. 4 sentences long. I read it once, then read it again, then a third time. What does it mean? Owen asked. Leave the treaties on the table. I set the tablet down. I thought about Edward Cross and what he used to say about humanity. He used to say we were a species that could tolerate humiliation for an extraordinarily long time, patiently and quietly and with enormous discipline, and then stop tolerating it all at once, completely, without any of the gradualism that other species relied on when they were upset. It means, I said carefully, that while we have been flying home, they have been voting. Owen stared at me. It's been 14 hours. Pull the legislative feed, I said. The UN Emergency Council session. He pulled it. We read it together. 47 bilateral compliance agreements with the Concordat, signed across 60 years of painstaking diplomatic work, dissolved by a vote that had passed 3 hours ago. Owen sat down without being invited to. I did not mind. He looked at the feed for a long time, reading and rereading, because the numbers kept being what they were. They bypassed the standard legal review period, he said. Emergency session, 3/4 majority, full quorum. Passed, I said. Why, he said. It was not a challenge. It was genuine bewilderment. He was 26 years old, and he had spent 3 years learning that diplomacy was patience and process and the long, careful accumulation of small advantages. What he was reading was none of those things. I thought about the ease in Sorvan's voice. Because they heard it, I said. They heard all of it, every sound. The Meridian kept flying. Behind us, 12 light years away, something very old had quietly ended. And in the silence where it had been, something new had already started moving. There is a moment in every long diplomatic posting when you understand that you are not dealing with logic, or fairness, or any of the principles that the framework claims to be built on. You are dealing with a power arrangement that has been in place long enough to mistake itself for a natural law. You are dealing with beings who are not cruel, exactly, but who have never needed to question whether the world they inherited was the right shape, because the shape of the world has always, in every relevant way, worked well for them. I had understood that intellectually before the vote. I had read enough history, human and otherwise, to know what institutional power looks like from inside and outside simultaneously. But understanding something in your mind is not the same as feeling it in the room, in real time, in your body. While 400 species produce their particular versions of amusement, and the translation matrices push all of those sounds into your inner ear, at once, I had felt it in the room, I had carried it out of the room, and now, sitting in the forward cabin of a small diplomatic shuttle, moving through space at 12% of what was possible, with a message on the tablet beside me that said, "Leave the treaties on the table." I understood that 12 billion people had felt it too, through the recording I had sent home, in their own kitchens and offices and transport vehicles and public spaces, in every language the planet spoke. They had felt the ease, and they had answered it. I smiled at my cold tea. It was the first time I had smiled since we left Earth, and it felt very good. The first thing I noticed when we landed was that everyone was watching screens. Not just some people, everyone. The diplomatic reception staff at Geneva Starport, the freight coordinators in the loading bays, the ground crews working the tarmac outside. Everywhere I looked as the Meridian taxied to its berth, through every window and every open doorway, screens. And on every screen, the same recording. Sorvan's voice translated into the language of whoever was watching, clear and measured and completely without hesitation, filling rooms across the planet. I had expected the recording to spread. I had sent it to spread. What I had not entirely anticipated was the particular quality of the silence that had settled around it. Not grief, not outrage in the loud and public sense. Something quieter, something that reminded me of the way very cold water looks perfectly still on the surface while deep currents move beneath it. Clara Whitfield met us at the vehicle bay. She was the ground coordination officer for our office, 3 years in the role. Organized and professional, and normally asked keep her expression neutral regardless of the circumstances. She was not keeping it neutral now. Delegate Osi Mensa, she said. The Secretary General is waiting. She would like to see you before the afternoon session. I looked at her face. How is she? I asked. Clara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Focused, she said. That one word told me everything I needed to know. Helen Vance had been Secretary General for 6 years. Before that, she had been the director of the External Relations Division for 11 years. And before that, she had been in field diplomacy for 16 years. And through all of it, she had maintained the particular kind of calm that belongs to people who have decided, very early in their lives, that they will not be moved by things that other people find upsetting. She had believed in our third Concordat application. She had given it resources and credibility and her personal endorsement, and she had sat in her office and watched the recording of what that endorsement had produced. I did not know exactly what she was going to say to me, but I knew she was not going to say she was sorry for sending me. The briefing room attached to her main office was small, with a round table and a window that looked over the lake. She was standing when I came in, which she did not always do, and she poured water for both of us before sitting down, and she looked at me with those deep, considered eyes. Yara, she said. Just my name. Helen, I said. A moment of quiet. Outside the lake, inside, the two of us and the weight of what we were both carrying. I owe you an apology, she said. I sent you into that chamber without adequate intelligence on Sorvan's intent. I knew he was likely to oppose the application. I did not anticipate the form it would take. His record was available, I said carefully. I reviewed it last night, she said. He has done something like this before. 3 previous applications from smaller species, rejected in sessions where he personally led the rebuttal. In each case he used data, accurate data, and then made a statement designed not to argue but to humiliate. I should have caught it. I did not. She paused. You stood in that room alone, Yara. I am sorry for that. Owen was there, I said. Owen is 26, she said. With gentle precision. She was right. I acknowledged it with a nod. Then she leaned forward slightly, her hands flat on the table. Tell me what you saw, she said. Not the report, not the formal account. Tell me what you actually experienced. So I told her. I told her about the quality of the laughter, the way it moved through 400 species simultaneously, each one expressing it differently, but all of them expressing the same thing. I told her about Sorvan's data and how it was all accurate, every figure, and how the accuracy was part of the method because there was nothing to argue against when the facts were right. I told her about his voice, the flatness of it, the absence of any concern that what he was saying might carry weight with the person it was directed, and I told her about the ease. I kept coming back to the ease. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. The ease is the key thing, she said. Yes, he was not performing contempt, she said. He was not trying to insult you in the way that someone tries to insult you when they want a reaction. He simply did not consider your reaction a relevant factor. You were not a variable in his calculation. No, I said. We weren't. She nodded slowly. That is actually a more useful piece of information than an insult would have been, she said. An insult means they fear you enough to want to wound you. What Sorvan did means they have not yet begun to think about fear. I sat with that for a moment. It was a pre-observation, and I could tell she had been working on it since the recording arrived. How does the council look? I asked. She pulled her tablet from the table and turned it toward me. It showed the vote tally from the emergency council session. Each member's position clearly marked. It passed while you were still in transit, she said. 4 hours from quorum to final result. I have been in this office for 6 years and I have never seen this body move that quickly. The legal emergency declaration, the procedural waiver, the quorum call, all of it completed in 4 hours. She paused. They wanted this. That is the only way it happens that fast. Not the vote I asked for. This vote. This specific action. How many of them had already decided before the recording arrived, I asked. She considered the question. Some had. There is a faction in the council that has argued for years that our Concordat strategy was costing us more than we were gaining. But they were a minority, and they did not have the momentum to move the others. She paused. The recording gave them the moment. I thought about the laughter again. 387 expressions of amusement, played back through every screen on Earth. All those alien sounds that meant the same thing. They heard it as a species, I said. Yes, she said, they did. She wanted me in an expanded role. Not as a Concordat delegate because we no longer had any Concordat relationship to represent, as a witness. The government wanted the persons who had been in that room to stand visibly beside everything they did from this point forward, because the story of why mattered as much as the story of what. I accepted without hesitation. I had nowhere else to be, and no one who needed to be there more than I did. The briefings started that same afternoon. Not diplomatic protocol briefings, technical briefings. I sat in rooms with scientists and engineers and project leads, who had been waiting years for a cleared status that had never arrived, and who were now speaking with the speed and energy of people who had been stationary for a very long time, and had just been given permission to move. The lead propulsion theorist was a woman named Kate Aldridge, who had the manner of someone who had been told no so often that she had stopped asking, and had instead been quietly preparing for the moment the answer changed. She walked me through a database of research that had been sitting in restricted files for years. Theoretical work and prototype specifications and engineering models that could not be implemented under the compliance accords. Some of it had been completed. Some of it had been in the final stages of completion for 3 years. All of it was real and all of it was ready. I asked her how long before the first results were visible. She said, "Depends what you mean by visible." The Copernicus array came online on a Thursday morning 4 weeks after we returned. I was standing on the outer observation deck of Meridian Station, which had been repurposed from a Concordat liaison hub into an Earth operations center, with Helen and Arthur Blythe, the array's director, and a small group of engineers who had spent 11 years building something they had not been allowed to finish. Arthur Blythe was a quiet man with careful hands and the kind of patience that is not the same as resignation. He had led the Copernicus project since the beginning. He had watched it come to 92% completion under the technical leadership of teams he trusted completely. He had filed the Concordat review applications twice and watched both of them deprioritized and quietly allowed to expire. He had continued to work on the theoretical framework and the component maintenance and the peripheral systems during the frozen years, because there was nothing else he was going to do with his professional life except see this through. When the array's final relay sequence activated across 240 kilometers of precisely aligned collection panels, the power reading on the station's display changed in a way that took me several seconds to fully process. I kept checking the unit. The unit was correct. That's one section, Arthur said beside me. He said it the way you say something that has been waiting a very long time to be said. The full array is 12 sections. I did the arithmetic in my head. Then I did it again because I wanted to be sure. Then I stopped doing the arithmetic because the number was too large for me to hold comfortably. So I looked at the panels instead, catching light across their enormous surface, doing quietly and steadily what they had been built to do. Helen stood at the window and watched in silence. After a long time she said, "How long has it been at 92%? 6 years, Arthur said. She nodded once. She did not say anything else about it because there was nothing useful to say. 2 days after the array came online, a Vithara diplomatic drone arrived at Luna Station and transmitted a request for formal dialogue regarding what it called disruption to the established Concordat relational framework. The language was careful and formal and entirely predictable. Helen's office sent a response 12 hours later, 12 words, politely worded. The communication channel was under review and was not currently available for incoming transmissions. Owen was with me when I read the response. He looked at it for a moment. "That is a very diplomatic way of saying no," he said. "It is not a no," I said. "It is a not yet. The difference matters." "What's the difference?" he asked. "A no means we are responding to them," I said. "A not yet means we are deciding when the conversation happens, and on whose terms." He thought about that. "So we're making them wait. We're making them consider," I said. "It's more uncomfortable." 3 more research teams went to full capacity that week, another 4 the week after that. The legislative backlog was clearing faster than anyone had projected, because the legal teams were working in shifts, and the political will behind them was absolute. Every project that came off the restricted list was a piece of something larger, and the larger thing was beginning to take a shape that I could feel building around me, even when I could not see all of its edges. Kate Aldridge invited me to Callisto 6 weeks after the arrays came online. I flew up on a standard transport, and she met me in the facility's main corridor wearing the expression of someone who has been quietly preparing a very large surprise for a very long time. She walked me through the dry dock. The Callisto facility had been operating under treaty restrictions for decades, building and maintaining the kind of ships the Concordat permitted Earth to have. Reliable ships, capable ships, in their way. Ships that moved at speeds the compliance accords had defined as appropriate for a provisional species. Those speeds were, Kate told me with the precision of someone who had spent years thinking about the gap, approximately 12% of what the theoretical framework supported. The theoretical framework had been in a restricted file since before I joined the diplomatic service. Why 12%? I asked her. She looked at me. It was the maximum they permitted, she said, and we never had any basis to ask why they chose that number. She paused. I have a theory, but it is only a theory. Tell me, at 12%, a vessel from Earth takes a minimum of 4 years to reach the nearest Concordat monitoring station, she said. At the speeds our current framework supports, it takes significantly less. She let that sit. I think the limit was never about what we were capable of. I think it was about what they could monitor. I did not respond immediately. I thought about the ease in Sorvan's voice. I thought about the leash that had never been described as a leash. When will you have something to show me? I asked. Already have it, she said. She pushed open the dry dock door. I had been expecting a ship. I had been expecting a ship that was impressive, that was larger than what we normally built. That was a visible demonstration of what unrestricted engineering looked like after years of constraint. I had been expecting to be impressed. I had not been expecting to feel the scale of it as a physical presence, something that altered the space around it simply by existing in it, the way very large things alter the air and the light and the silence of the room they occupy. The vessel in the dry dock was 2,300 meters long. I stood in the doorway for a moment without moving. I was aware that my mouth had opened slightly and I closed it with some effort. How long? I said. 9 months from cleared status to current completion, Kate said. We had the components, we had the research, we had the teams. We were just not allowed to assemble them. She has a name, I said. The ECV threshold, Kate said. I walked the forward sections with Kate and the project leads, moving through corridors that had a weight to them, a settled, certain quality that I had not felt in any vessel I had been aboard before. Not because they were intimidating, because they were confident. There is a difference between those two things that is difficult to describe but completely unmistakable when you experience it. Captain Priya Nair met us in the forward operations section. She was a compact woman with close-cropped hair and a manner that reminded me of Arthur. Blythe, the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly what you are standing on and trusting it completely. She shook my hand and showed me the forward observation configuration and answered my questions with the patient clarity of someone who loved what she knew. When does she go out? I asked. When you have somewhere to take her, Captain Nair said. She looked at me steadily. I understand that may be sooner than later. I looked around the forward section. Through the viewports, the construction lighting of the dry dock. Beyond that, the dark of Callisto's surface. Beyond that space and within it, a station called Nexusville, where a being named Sorvan had made a joke at humanity's expense and been laughed at from 400 different directions. Yes, I said, it may be. On the way back down to Earth, I watched the planet from the transport's small viewport and thought about what the Concordat had been doing for 80 years while they watched us. They had given us enough to keep us engaged, enough access to keep us interested, enough hope to keep us asking nicely, and they had taken from us not money or territory but speed, reach, the ability to be somewhere they were not expecting us to be. The leash had been real, it had just been invisible, which is the kind of leash that works best. I arrived back at the Geneva office in the early evening. Owen was still at his desk, which did not surprise me. He had developed a habit of staying late since we returned from Nexus Vale, as though he was afraid of missing something. I sat down across from him, and I told him what I had seen at Callisto. I told him about the threshold and its 2,300 meters, and the 9-month build time. I told him what Kate Aldridge had said about the 12% speed limit and her theory about monitoring range. He listened to all of it, then he said, "How many more?" "The second launch is in 4 months," I said. "6 by end of year." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said quietly, more to himself than to me, "We were already this. We were already all of this. They just made sure we couldn't show it." "Yes," I said. He looked at his hands. Outside the window, the Geneva evening was soft and clear, the Alps going dark against the sky, an ordinary Earth sky, the sky of a planet that had, according to the Concordat's best speaker, nearly destroyed itself twice and could not be trusted with a seat at the table. We were still here, though, still here, and still building, and for the first time in 80 years, asking no one's permission. The first ship they saw was not the largest one. That was Helen Vance's decision, and I considered it then, and still consider it now, to be one of the most precise strategic choices of her career. She could have sent the Threshold first. It would have been visible in the most immediate and undeniable sense, but she sent a mid-range survey vessel named the Linden instead, a 41-person crew, moving through the Kethava belt at speeds the compliance accords had never permitted Earth to use. The Linden did not make any transmissions on Concordat frequencies. It did not approach any sensitive installation or make contact with any species along its route. It conducted a standard stellar survey, filed its data, and came home. The Concordat's formal notice arrived 9 days later. 17 pages, 43 cited treaty articles, the language of institutional authority writing a strongly worded letter to a situation it did not yet fully understand. Every treaty article cited was from agreements Earth had dissolved 3 months earlier. Arthur Blythe, who had developed a habit of appearing in planning sessions at moments that turned out to be important, read the notice with an expression of deep satisfaction. He set it down on the table with the care of someone handling something that does not deserve rough treatment and said nothing for a moment. Then he folded his hands and said that it was the most expensive piece of paper the Concordat had ever sent, because it was going to cost them more to send it than they had budgeted for. "They're still writing to the entity that existed before," he said. "They don't have another model," Owen said. He had, in the month since our return, grown into something sharper than the young aide I had taken to Nexus Vale. He thought now in layers. "Their entire understanding of Earth is based on 80 years of a specific behavior pattern. We stopped that behavior pattern and they have not yet updated the picture." That was exactly right, and it was the thing that shaped everything that followed in the months after the walkout. The Concordat was not stupid. Its member species included some of the most sophisticated civilizations in known space, with 4,000 years of institutional memory, and the kind of long-range strategic thinking that comes from governing on timescales that make human history look brief. But their intelligence was calibrated to a version of us that no longer existed, and recalibration takes time, especially when the change is more complete than you have imagined possible. The response from Nexus Vale had revealed something important, and I kept turning it over in the days after we received it. The Concordat's formal machinery, all of its centuries-old procedural language and citation frameworks and review protocols, had been built to manage a specific kind of situation, a species that was inside the relational structure and subject to its authority. Their response to the Linden's transit treated us as though we were still that species. They cited the compliance accords. They issued formal notices. They used the vocabulary of an institutional body addressing a member that had violated an agreement. We were not a member. We had no agreements with them. The compliance accords no longer existed. The gap between what they were saying and what was actually true was significant, and it told me something about the difference between an institution that is used to being obeyed and an institution that is used to being right. An institution that is used to being obeyed assumes that the vocabulary of authority is sufficient to produce compliance. It does not question whether the vocabulary applies. It does not verify that the relationship it is assuming still holds. It simply speaks in the register it has always spoken in, because that register has always worked before, and the idea that it might stop working requires a kind of imagination that 4,000 years of unbroken precedent does not encourage. I was not unsympathetic. I had spent 8 years inside that vocabulary myself, learning its protocols and its conventions and the particular patience it required. I understood the logic of it from the inside, but understanding something and being willing to remain subject to it are different things, and I had crossed that line the day the Meridian flew home. The Vethera Dominion sent 2 more formal communications in the month after the Linden's transit. Each arrived on the standard diplomatic frequency. Each was courteously acknowledged by Helen's office and placed in what we had begun, calling the review queue, which was technically accurate. Everything was under review. We were reviewing what we wanted our relationship with the galaxy to look like, and that review was proceeding carefully, and without any external deadline. I was present for a meeting in the 4th month when the Keth Collective sent their first inquiry. The Keth were a cephalopod-descended civilization with 12 Concordat seats, a long reputation for practical thinking over ideological positioning, and a trade network that touched a significant fraction of known space. Their message came through a commercial relay, not a Concordat channel, which told me that whoever sent it had thought carefully about how to reach us in a way that was not filtered through the formal structure. It was addressed to our Office of External Relations, and it asked, in careful and neutral language, whether Earth was currently open to bilateral discussion outside the Concordat framework. I read it twice in Helen's office that afternoon. She was watching me read it. "This is different from the Vethara inquiries," I said. "Completely different," she said. "The Vethura are asking us to return to what we were. The Keth are asking what we are now." We began a quiet, informal dialogue with the Keth trade representatives within the week. The first conversation was conducted over a relay that technically classified the exchange as a commercial inquiry, which gave both sides a procedural cover that neither of us needed, but both of us appreciated in a practical sense. The Keth representative assigned to the dialogue was a being named Vale Thos, which was, I was told, a name given to individuals specifically designated for extended external relationship work, a cultural signal I found clarifying. They had sent their best. Vale Thos had an approach to conversation that I found immediately useful. They did not negotiate in the traditional sense, not position and counterposition, not the long game of concession management. They asked what Earth needed. They said what the Keth Collective needed. They waited to see where the overlap was, and then they talked about the overlap. It was, I realized over the course of our second conversation, the most efficient approach to external relations I had ever encountered, and it made me think, not for the first time, about how much of what I had been trained to call diplomacy was actually the management of artificial complexity created by the existing framework. Under the Concordat structure, two species wishing to develop a relationship had to route that relationship through layers of review and approval, committee oversight and framework compliance. The Concordat called this stability. It was, in practice, a mechanism that ensured the established order remained the mediator of every relationship, and therefore retained relevance and authority over all of them. A species could not simply speak directly to another species without going through the structure. Not officially, not in ways that would be recognized and enforced. We were outside the structure. The Keth, on this channel on this day, were choosing to be outside it too. That choice had a cost for them, and I did not minimize it in my own thinking. They had 12 Concordat seats. They had relationships and obligations within the established order that predated this conversation by centuries. They were not abandoning any of that, but they were choosing, in a practical and visible way, to also have a relationship that was not mediated by anyone, and that choice was irreversible once you made it, because you could not unsee the conversation you had already had. Nothing binding, nothing announced. Two species talking about what each of them needed and what each of them had, without anyone above them approving the topic list in advance. It was the most natural conversation I had been part of in the entire length of my diplomatic career, which told me something significant about what was wrong with the career I had been trained for. In the 6th month, I went back to Callisto. The threshold was complete. Kate Aldridge walked me through the final systems check documentation with the precision of someone for whom precision is a form of affection. Everything was in order. Everything had been tested. Captain Nair and her crew of 240 were aboard and ready, and the ship was waiting with the particular patience of something that has been built for movement, and is temporarily, voluntarily still. I stood on the observation deck of the dry dock and looked at the vessel, and thought about the journey I was already planning. Helen and I had discussed it in deep timing. The purpose, the size of the delegation, what we would say and more importantly, what we would not. Owen came to stand beside me. He looked at the threshold for a long time. "You know what I keep thinking?" he said. "Tell me." "I keep thinking about that corridor," he said. "After the vote, when you stopped and let Sorvan see your face." He paused. "I watched you do that. I didn't understand it at the time." "What do you understand now?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "That it wasn't anger," he said. "You weren't showing him you were angry, you were remembering him. You were making sure you would remember exactly." "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly. "I think I'd like to be there," he said. "When we go back." I looked at him. 3 years ago, he had been a junior aide who brought me badly timed cups of tea and looked surprised by the galaxy. Now he was someone who understood the difference between anger and memory, and why the difference mattered. "You'll be there," I said. The Concordat's response to our growing independent program became, in the 7th and 8th months, something that moved beyond formal notices. They began what they called a review of provisional species status, which was their mechanism for examining whether an observed species had demonstrated the characteristic required for continued provisional relationship. It was, in practical terms, a threat to reduce our already minimal formal standing. Helen read the notification and set it down and looked at me across the table in her office. I looked back at her. "They want us to be afraid of losing something," she said. "What do we have left to lose?" I asked. She picked up the notification and placed it in the review queue without another word. We were building. That was the constant underneath everything else in those months. Every week brought another cleared research file, another activated project, another team that had been marking time for years now moving at full capacity. The Callisto facility was working around the clock. The second capital vessel, a ship they were calling the ECV Mariner, was progressing on schedule. The energy collection capacity from the Copernicus array had passed all initial projections by the 5th month. I toured the array's main operations center with Arthur Blythe in the 8th month. He showed me the output readings across all 12 active sections, and the projections for the additional 3 sections that were now under construction, no longer frozen at 92% and waiting for a review that was never going to come. "What does this give us?" I asked him. He thought about how to answer that simply. "It gives us reach," he said, "real reach. Sustained operations at distances we have never been able to sustain before. The limiting factor in deep space presence has always been energy. You need it to move, to maintain, to operate. What we have here changes that calculation completely." He paused. "We can be present in places we have never been able to be present, and we can stay there." I looked at the output readings. Numbers that did not fit comfortably in my head, the same way the numbers from the drive specifications and the construction timelines and the research database had not fitted comfortably in my head. It was not that they were too large. It was that they kept requiring me to revise what I thought I understood about the situation, and each revision made the previous understanding look smaller. "They kept us at 12%, I said. "They kept us at 12%? Arthur confirmed. He said it without bitterness. He had spent too many years working to have energy left for bitterness. I think they understood what the full number was. I think they knew exactly how large the gap was between what they permitted and what was possible. That gap was not an accident. I looked at the panel readouts for a long time. The light coming through the observation window fell across my hands. "No," I said, "it was not. The Vithara sent their 5th formal communication in the 9th month. Unlike the previous 4, which had arrived through standard Concordat channels, this one came through a commercial relay, directly addressed to me by name, in 2 Earth languages, from a senior Vithara liaison officer. It requested a private conversation with a senior Earth representative at my earliest convenience. I forwarded it to Helen with 3 words. "He is nervous," she replied. In the 6th month, 3 of the minor species that had voted against Earth's Concordat application sent quiet, informal inquiries through third-party relays, not through Concordat channels, not through formal diplomatic correspondence, through commercial intermediaries and research consortium communications, and, in one case, a personal message from a scientist to a colleague at one of our universities, asking whether Earth's current external affairs posture might leave room for a conversation about a shared research interest. I read each of those inquiries carefully. What they had in common was the indirection. None of them wanted to be seen reaching out. None of them wanted their name attached to a formal record of contact with Earth outside the Concordat framework. But they were reaching, all the same, because something had changed in their calculation about what Earth was, and what relationship with Earth might be worth. Helen read the same inquiries and said, "They voted against us in public. Now they want to talk to us in private. Because in public, the cost of voting with the Concordat was 0, I said. In private, they are beginning to calculate the cost of not having a relationship with us." She nodded slowly. "How long before that calculation changes their public behavior?" "Depends on how fast the Concordat's credibility deteriorates," I said, "and how useful we become in the meantime." We were already becoming useful. The research programs that had come off the restricted list were producing output that was, in several fields, genuinely novel. Not improvements on existing Concordat science. New directions. Human science had always had a particular character that our advisory teams had attributed to various things over the years, our short generations, our parallel processing tendency to develop competing approaches simultaneously, the specific way our history of internal competition had shaped our research culture. Whatever the reason, when we stopped asking the Concordat what we were allowed to investigate and started investigating everything we wanted to, the results arrived quickly and they arrived in unexpected places. Kate Aldridge published 3 theoretical papers in the 7th month that the Keth Collective's own research institute requested translation rights for within 2 weeks. Arthur Bly's Energy Systems team had already been in contact with 2 Concordat member species about their array methodology, not because they had announced anything, but because the output of the array was visible on long-range sensors, and the questions came naturally. We were not advertising ourselves. We did not need to. Being present and capable, without restriction, was its own kind of signal, and the galaxy was paying attention. I went back to the Callisto facility in the 10th month for the Threshold's formal commissioning. It was a small ceremony because Captain Nair did not like ceremonies, and because the people who had built the ship were more interested in what came next than in marking what was already done. Helen was there. Arthur was there. Kate and Owen and a group of the engineering leads who had put years of careful, restricted, patient work into what was now complete. We stood in the main operations deck, and Captain Nair walked us through the final system status in her unhurried way, answering questions with the ease of someone who trusts completely what she is describing. When we reached the propulsion section of the briefing, she pulled up the drive specifications and read them aloud, and I watched the faces of the people around me as they heard the numbers. Owen wrote something down. I noticed because he had not brought a notepad, and he had to borrow one from the engineer beside him. After the briefing, when the group had dispersed into smaller conversations, and the officers had returned to their stations, Owen came to stand beside me near the viewport. 12%, he said. He showed me what he had written, the permitted speed, the actual capability. The difference between them, expressed as a ratio that looked, written on paper, like a number that should have been obvious all along. Yes, I said. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. I did not ask him why. I understood why. Some things you want to keep in a form you can hold. The next morning at 0600 station time, the ECV Threshold departed the Callisto facility and entered deep space for the first time. I was aboard. Owen was aboard. Captain Nair stood at the operations desk with the stillness of absolute competence, and the ship moved around us with a quiet certainty that I felt in the soles of my feet and in my sternum, and in some part of me that had no name but knew what this was. We were moving at a speed that no Earth vessel had ever moved before. We were moving toward Nexus Vale. The invitation came from the Ethany. I had thought about them in the months since the vote, the single abstention in a chamber of 388. The one voice that had declined to join the unanimous verdict. An abstention is not an endorsement. It is not agreement or support or any active expression of belief. But it is also not the same as a no, and in a room where everything else was a no, it had occupied a specific space in my memory that I kept returning to without entirely understanding why. Now I understood. They had been waiting. They had wanted to see what we would do. The communication from the Atheny arrived 11 months after the walkout, addressed to Helen Vance's office. It was carefully written, longer than the Vethara inquiries, structured in a way that suggested multiple writers and multiple revisions over a period of time. The central proposal was a convening, not a Concordat session, and the document was very clear about that distinction, using language that specifically excluded any Concordat process or authority, a separate gathering, outside Concordat jurisdiction, open to any species that wished to attend. The Etheny called it a forum for new frameworks in an evolving galactic order, which was a carefully chosen phrase that meant something direct without saying it directly. They asked if Earth would attend, and at the end, in a section worded with great care, they asked if Earth would consider co-hosting. Helen showed me the message on a Tuesday morning and poured coffee for both of us before she said anything, which she only did when the situation was significant. They reached out to 17 other species first, she said. Our analysis team traced the communication chain. 11 have already indicated interest. 6 are current Concordat members. I looked at the list she slid across the table. 3 of the names were expected. 1 was not. The Keth Collective, I said. The Keth Collective, she confirmed. They have been quiet for a long time, and then they were not quiet at all. The informal bilateral conversations we had been having with the Keth for the past several months had, according to our own economists, been the most productive diplomatic engagement Earth had conducted with any alien species in the entire history of our contact program. No framework overhead, no multilateral approval process, no carefully monitored topic lists. Just two species with specific things to offer and specific things they needed, talking directly about both. The Concordat had noticed. They had sent a communication expressing what they called grave concern about fragmentation of the established relational framework. We had placed it in the review queue. There is one more element, Helen said. She pulled up a second document on her tablet and turned it toward me. It was the deployment summary for the threshold. I had seen previous versions of it. This version had a destination filled in. I read it. You want me to go back, I said. I want you to go back as yourself, she said. Not as an applicant. Not as someone requesting consideration or membership or a review of any kind. As a representative of a species that has something to say and the position to say it plainly. She held my eyes. That is a different kind of journey than the one you made the last time. I thought about the Meridian, its small viewport, and its diplomatic colors, and the cold tea and the 14 hours of silence before we arrived home. I thought about what I had been carrying when I was on that ship. The weight of a third rejection. The weight of the ease in Sorvan's voice. That weight was gone now. I had put it down somewhere in the months of building and unfolding and watching the world we actually were become visible, and I had not picked it up again. And the threshold comes with us, I said. Captain Nair is already briefed, Helen said. The Concordat's reaction to the Athenese Forum invitation, when it became known to them, was slower than I had expected, which suggested to me that it had been debated internally for some time before any public position was taken. When the formal reaction did arrive, it took the form of a communication to the Athene directly, which was notable, because it meant the Concordat had decided to address the convening through its organizer, rather than through the species it was most obviously aimed at. Whether that was because they thought the Athene were more persuadable, or because they were not yet ready to address Earth directly, I could not be certain. The Athene's response was brief and precise. They noted that the forum was a voluntary gathering outside Concordat jurisdiction and required no Concordat approval, and that the decision of any species to attend or not attend was entirely their own. They thanked the Concordat for its communication and closed the channel. Calith Sorn sent me a copy of the exchange. At the bottom, in a small addendum, they noted that 3 more species had confirmed attendance after reading the Concordat's message. I showed it to Owen. He read it twice. The Concordat's message made more species want to attend, he said. When you tell people they should not be somewhere, I said, it tends to make the somewhere more interesting. He thought about that. Then he said, do you think Sorvan knows he's going to be there? I looked at the attendee list. Sorvan's name was not on it, but the Vithara Dominion's formal communications in the weeks before the forum had taken on a quality that was slightly different from the earlier notices, less institutional in their phrasing, more individually authored, as though the person writing them was no longer following a template. Someone senior was paying personal attention. I spent the time before departure reading, not briefing documents. The philosophical texts of the species that had indicated interest in the Athene S Forum. The Keth Collective's published works on the ethics of mutual relationship. The Athene's own internal histories of the assembly vote, which they had released to their own public record, and which I had translated. There was a passage in those histories that I read 3 times, because it described the moment of the abstention in terms I had not expected. The Athene records said that their delegation had abstained because they were uncertain what humanity would become, and they preferred the discipline of waiting over the error, of deciding prematurely. I found that more generous than I had expected a species to be toward another species they had never seriously considered before that day. Owen read the same passage when I shared it with him. He was quiet for a moment afterward. They were watching, he said. Yes. And what they watched changed the answer. Yes, I said. He nodded. Then, let's make sure they can see clearly. We departed on a clear morning. Helen came to the docking port, and she shook Owen's hand and held mine for a moment longer than a handshake, the way people do when they have already said everything and are simply making sure it is still true. Yara, she said. I know, I said. We boarded. Captain Nair brought the threshold alive beneath us, and we moved. And I sat in the forward observation room and watched Earth fall away through the viewport, growing smaller until it was the same beautiful, improbable blue it always was from above, and then the distance took it. The journey to Nexus Vale took 4 days at our operational speed, significantly less than the Meridian had taken, which had been traveling at 12% of what we were currently doing. Owen spent the transit reading. Captain Nair ran system checks with the methodical care of someone who trusts their ship and trusts it more the better she knows it. I slept and read and sat in the forward observation room with cups of tea that were, on this ship, reliably warm, because the galley staff took their work seriously. I thought on the third night of the transit about what I was going to say, not the words. I had decided not to use prepared words. I was going to walk into whatever room the Ethany had arranged and speak plainly about what Earth was, what it wanted, and what it was offering. The specific sentences would come when the room was in front of me, and the specific people were in it. That was how I worked best, and I had spent too many years trying to work differently. What I thought about instead was what it would mean to build something. I had spent my career working toward a specific goal within a specific framework, and the framework had been the thing I accepted without questioning, because it was the only framework that existed. The Concordat had been the shape of the galaxy's political structure for 4,000 years, and you did not, in the practical reality of your daily work, spend very much time imagining what the galaxy might look like with a different shape. You worked within the shape you had. You tried to move through it toward the things you needed. You measured your progress against its internal standards. What I had realized in the past 11 months, gradually and then all at once in the way that important things tend to clarify themselves, was that the framework was not neutral. It had been built by specific species for specific purposes at a specific historical moment, and it had accumulated 4,000 years of precedent and authority. That made it look like the natural order of things rather than a particular set of choices made by particular beings at a particular time. The Concordat was not wrong about everything. It had managed to keep a significant portion of known space from catastrophic conflict for a very long time. That was real, and it mattered, and I was not interested in dismissing it. But managing conflict and providing equal voice were not the same thing, and the Concordat had been structured, from the beginning, by species that already had power, and structured in ways that allowed them to retain it. The hierarchy of founding members, the provisional status categories, the review processes that could be deprioritized and allowed to expire, without formal rejection. The compliance accords that restricted what species could do without approval from an oversight body that the species had no vote in. All of it had the shape of a system designed to look like fairness while delivering something considerably more useful to the people who built it. I did not think Sorvan was a bad being. I did not think the Vithara Dominion was evil or the Concordat was a conspiracy. I thought they had built a structure that served their interests, and then spent 4,000 years mistaking their interests for the interests of everyone. That mistake is not unique to alien civilizations. Humans had made the same mistake many times in our own history, often with great sincerity and genuine conviction that what we were doing was right. The conviction does not make the structure just, and the structure does not become just simply because you have stopped noticing that it is not. We needed a different table, not a petition, not an application, something actual, with weight and presence, a structure that other species could walk into and find equal footing in. I had spent my career trying to win a seat at a table that had been built without us in mind. It occurred to me, in the quiet of the forward observation room with the stars moving past the viewport, at a speed that had been forbidden to us until 4 months ago, that the table itself was the problem. If the table is built by species who have decided who belongs at it, then the table is never going to offer what it promises. Not to the species it was built for, and certainly not to the ones who had to ask permission to approach it. You build a different table. You build it from the beginning with different rules as one species, one voice, no hierarchy encoded into the structure from the moment of founding. It sounds simple. The simplest things always sound simple. Making them real is the work, and the work requires people willing to show up. I thought about the 26 species who had confirmed their attendance. Then the 29 who had actually arrived, plus 3 more who had decided at the last moment that whatever was happening at the outer ring of Nexus Vale was worth seeing for themselves. I thought about what made them come, not the Athene, who had been the organizers and had their own long-considered reasons, not the Keth, who had been signaling their interest for months and whose presence was the logical conclusion of a relationship already in progress. The others, the species I had not spoken to before, whose names were on the attendee list as confirmations that had arrived in the final days, whose representatives had walked into a secondary assembly room in the outer ring of Nexus Vale, without being told to by the Concordat, without any of the official framework that normally defined whether a gathering was worth attending. They had come because something had happened in that main chamber 1 year ago And they had seen it, and they had been thinking about what it meant. Not just Sorvan's speech, the whole of it. The ease of it, the completeness of the verdict, the 387 votes and the 1 abstention and the 0 in favor. And then, 12 months later, the quiet, rapid, unmistakable evidence that the species that had received that verdict had responded not by pleading for reconsideration, but by building. Building was a language everyone understood. You could argue with intentions and discount claims and question motives and deprioritize applications. You could not argue with the Copernicus array. You could not deprioritize a capital vessel. You could not discount output data from 41 research teams that was, in several fields, producing things that the Concordat's own member species had not produced and could not easily replicate. We had been small for 80 years. We had been small carefully and deliberately, and with great patience, because we believed the smallness was the price of access, and access was worth the price. The Concordat's vote had ended that belief not because we had given up on access but because the access had been made definitively clear for what it was, a controlled proximity managed from above, extended or withdrawn at the convenience of the beings who had built the structure, and who benefited from deciding who was allowed inside it. We had stopped being small, and the galaxy had noticed in ways that the Concordat had not prepared for. I thought about what came after this, after the signing, after the secondary assembly was established and functioning, after the 30-member species had begun the real, difficult, specific work of building an institution from the ground up with equal voice encoded into its structure from the first day. The work would be hard. Equal structures are harder to maintain than hierarchical ones, because there is no authority at the top to resolve disputes by declaration. You have to actually work through disagreement. You have to build mechanisms that are fair by design and not just by claim. You have to keep going when it is inconvenient. I was not worried about that. I had watched 12 billion people vote in 4 hours. I had watched a capital ship built in 9 months. I had watched Arthur Blythe stand on an observation deck and see the numbers on a readout that should, by rights, have made him cry, because he had spent 6 years maintaining a project at 92% and had never once in those 6 years stopped believing it would be finished. Humanity, when it decided something mattered, was very difficult to stop. The Concordat had never been required to understand that, because we had been the ones managing our own size. We were done managing it. And that, I thought, as the session below me moved toward its conclusion with the quiet efficiency of something that had been carefully prepared, was the thing that the Concordat had never modeled for. They had modeled for a species that wanted to join. They had modeled for a species that might become frustrated and make noise, send more applications, request escalated reviews, appeal to subcommittees. They had even, I suspected, modeled for a species that might become angry enough to make public statements of dissatisfaction while ultimately continuing to seek admission through official channels. They had not modeled for a species that simply stopped wanting what the Concordat was offering and started building something else. That was the part that could not be managed from inside their framework, because their framework had no category for it. A species that had left was a species you could potentially re-engage with in the future. A species that was building an alternative structure that other species were choosing to participate in was a different kind of development entirely. It was not a problem to be solved. It was a change in the landscape. Changes in the landscape require adaptation. The Concordat had not had to adapt to anything fundamental in a very long time. I found myself almost sympathetic about that, in the abstract, theoretical way that you can be sympathetic about a difficulty you have deliberately caused for someone who needed to encounter it. Almost sympathetic, not entirely. 29 species. In the room that the Concordat had not been watching, Nexus Vale looked the same from the outside. I had expected it to look different, because things that have carried enormous weight in your memory tend to look, in reality, smaller or stranger or somehow less than the version in your head. Nexus did not look smaller. It was still vast, still arrayed with its thousands of docking rings and communication platforms, and the constant movement of vessels from 100 civilizations going about the ordinary business of a galaxy that had been running for 4,000 years. But the threshold changed what the approach felt like. We had held position at a distance of 1,100 kilometers from the station's outer ring, which was within the zone of clear sensor visibility from any system the station operated, and well outside any formal jurisdiction boundary. Captain Nair had chosen the position herself with the precision of someone who understood that where you stand is as much a statement as what you say. Owen was in the forward observation room when the reaction started. He came to get me within 3 minutes. I stood beside him and looked at the sensor display. The station's approach traffic had shifted. Vessels that had been on standard inbound trajectories were altering their paths, not dramatically, not in ways that required any formal explanation, but visibly, the way water moves around something large, the way space reorganizes itself, slightly and unmistakably, around the presence of something it was not expecting. The view through the threshold's forward observation port had been one of the most stable and sustaining things I had seen in the past 4 days of transit. Stars do not change at these distances, not in the time it takes a human ship to cross them. They sit in their positions and they burn, and the space between them is what changes, or rather, your position within that space changes, and the perspective shifts accordingly, and what was ahead becomes what is behind, and what was distant becomes close. I had used that view to think, which was one of the most useful things a long transit offers, the sustained time to think without interruption or urgency, or the constant pressure of immediate decisions. On the meridian, flying home from the worst professional outcome of my career, I had also sat with a view of stars and thought. But that thinking had been different, dense with the immediate weight of what had just happened, reactive and interior, circling around the specific shock of the specific experience. This thinking was different. This was the thinking of someone who knows where they are going, and has time to consider what they intend to do when they arrive. I had space to think about what I wanted the next year to look like, what I wanted the next 10 years to look like. Not for Earth's Foreign Relations Office, for the species. For the 12 billion people who had watched that recording and voted in 4 hours and built a capital ship in 9 months and who deserved, as much as anyone in this galaxy, to have their voice heard on equal terms in the decisions that shaped the space they lived in. I had not been a particularly reflective person before the vote. I had been a productive one, focused and prepared and effective at navigating the systems I was given to navigate. I did not regret that. That focus had served a real purpose during the years it was necessary. But the vote had done something to me that I was still understanding. Month by month, it had made me stop accepting the frame, not the result, the frame itself. The assumption that the Concordat was the correct structure, and that Earth's job was to find its place within it. The Concordat was one structure among all the structures that were possible. The fact that it was 4,000 years old and covered a significant portion of known space did not make it correct. It made it established. Those are different things. I thought about that on the third night of the transit, with the stars visible through the viewport, and the threshold moving through them at a speed that 4 months ago had been technically forbidden, and I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to both of them, something that had been building in me since the day I walked out of the main chamber and let Sorvan see my face. Clarity. That was the word. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop looking at a situation through the assumptions you were handed, and look at it directly, in its actual shape, with your own eyes. Captain Nair appeared at my elbow. 14 hails, she said. 3 Concordat Standard. 4 Vithara Diplomatic, the Keth Collective, 2 unknowns, the Ethony, and 2 species I do not have in my current registration database. The unknowns, I said. How long to identify? My communications team says 40 minutes, she said. The Ethony first, I said. Hold the rest in queue. Calith Sorn came through on a clean channel, that distinctive voice like wind through reeds. The translated words arriving a half-second after the sound as always, giving every exchange a quality of considered deliberateness that I had come to genuinely appreciate. Delegate Osi Mensa, they said. You have arrived. We have been watching your approach. How does the room look? I asked. It holds 400, they said. We expect fewer today. The confirmed count this morning was 29. A pause. We have had 3 additional inquiries in the last 2 hours. 29 confirmed. 3 more incoming. In the room that was not the Concordat chamber, and had not been approved by any Concordat body, and had been arranged by a species that had, 1 year ago, been the only being in a 400-voice chamber to choose silence over a vote against us. We will bring a shuttle in approximately 90 minutes, I said. Is the secondary assembly space ready? It has been ready for 4 days, Calith Sorn said. I closed the channel and looked at Owen. He was looking at the sensor display, where the traffic adjustment around the threshold's position was still visible as a subtle but unmistakable reshaping of the ordinary patterns. They can see us, he said. Yes, I said. That was the point. I did not wear diplomatic colors. I had made that decision before we departed, and I did not second-guess it now. I wore plain dark clothes and no insignia, because I was not representing an application or a petition or a request for consideration. I was representing a species that had stopped performing for the species that were evaluating us, and had simply become what we already were. The shuttle carried us through Nexus Vale's outer approach and into the docking ring. I had been through this approach before, in the Meridian, sitting in the diplomatic shuttle colors, preparing the formal statement I had rehearsed for 9 languages. The physical experience of the approach was the same. The docking ring, the transition corridor, the passage through the station's outer shell into the heated, carefully maintained interior environment. What was different was what I was carrying. The secondary assembly chambers were in the outer ring, reached through a corridor that was less grand than the approaches to the main hall but better proportioned and better lit. Someone had brought in fresh environmental conditioning units along the wall, small and functional, each one tuned to a specific atmospheric requirement. The room itself was circular, curved seating rising in tiers from a central floor, older equipment than the main chamber but clean and operational. Someone had taken care of it. Species arrived over the following hour. I stood near the entrance and watched them come in, noting who they were and how they moved, and what their presence here said about their calculations. The Keth collective delegation was 5 beings moving with the considered precision of people who had made a decision they were completely comfortable with and had no interest in revisiting. The Ethany settled into a mid-tier section. The Faranu, a small and quiet species I had met once at a Concordat subcommittee session, and always remembered as attentive in a way that most species were not, arrived in a group of 3. Then a door opened on the far side of the chamber, and Archlegate Sorvan walked in. I had not known he was coming. I did not believe Calith Sorn had known either. I watched Calith Sorn look up at the sound of the door, and I watched the expression that crossed their face, a registered surprise that I found reassuring, because it confirmed that this had not been arranged or anticipated. Sorvan had come on his own. No official delegation, no Concordat insignia, 2 staff members only, both of them young, both of them doing what young staff members do in situations they have not been briefed on, which is hold very still and follow the senior person's lead. He found a seat in the upper tier. He did not look at me. He sat down and he was still, and he watched the room fill. I watched him for a moment before I looked away. He had crossed 12 light years to be in this room without an official brief, without Concordat authority, without the apparatus of his position and his status, and the 4,000 years of precedent that had always surrounded him when I had seen him before. He was here as himself. That was a significant choice, and I did not underestimate the cost of it. In the Vathara Dominion's political structure as I understood it, an archlegate, who attended an unofficial gathering outside Concordat channels was not technically in violation of any rule, but he was making a visible statement about where his personal attention was directed. His colleagues would know he was here. The Concordat's observation systems would have logged the Linden's approach patterns and the shuttle manifest. He had come anyway. I thought about what that meant. Not what he was going to do with the information he gathered here. Not what position he was going to take, or what message he was going to carry back to whatever internal conversation the Dominion was having about Earth. What I thought about was the fact that he had decided, personally and apparently of his own will, that being in this room mattered enough to accept that cost. A year ago, he had not needed to consider me at all. I was a variable with no weight in his calculation. A provisional species presenting its 3rd application, to be addressed efficiently and then set aside. He had done it with the ease of someone performing a routine task, and the ease had been genuine, which was the part that had stayed with me. That ease was gone. I could see it from across the room, in the quality of his stillness and the precise attention he was giving to everything around him. He was here to learn something. The specific something he was trying to learn was not yet clear, but the fact that he was trying, that he had decided learning was necessary, was itself the answer to a question I had been carrying. They had noticed, not just the Vethera. The Concordat in its long, 4,000-year-old institutional mind, had noticed that something had changed, and the nature of that change did not fit any of the models it had for managing species like us, and so the beings within it who took their responsibilities seriously had begun, individually and carefully, to come and look for themselves. Owen leaned close to my ear. Do we need to be concerned? I watched Sorvan for a moment, his posture, the precise angle of his forearms, the quality of his attention. He was watching, not monitoring, not recording for a Concordat report. He was here as himself in plain capacity, with no official brief. He came to see what we built, I said quietly. That is not a threat, it is information. The session opened when the last attendees had settled, 32 species. I had to count twice because I kept arriving at a different number from the one I had started with. 32 species in a secondary assembly room that had not been used in 11 years. In a station that had been built by a civilization that had decided 4,000 years ago what the galaxy should look like. I walked to the central floor. The room settled. I said, "1 year ago I stood in the main chamber of this station. I heard what the established order thinks of humanity, and I will tell you that some of what they said was accurate, and some of what they said was convenient, and it is not always easy to separate those things from the inside of the experience. I am not here to argue the record. I am here because what I heard in that chamber was not only an opinion about Earth, it was a demonstration of how this system works. Who is allowed to speak from a position of certainty? Who is expected to stand quietly and accept the judgment? Who is trusted with power and who is managed with access to the appearance of it?" I looked around the room. At Calith Sorn, at the Keth delegation, at the Feranu near the door, at the species whose names I was still learning and whose presence here already said something important. At Sorvan, in the upper tier, watching. "Earth is not applying for anything today," I said. "We are not requesting admission or provisional extension or a revised review timeline. We are here because we built something, and we want to share it with anyone who would like to be part of it. Not a seat that is granted. Not a voice that is permitted. A founding membership, equal from the first day, in a structure where no species enters at a lower tier than any other. One species. One vote hierarchy." The room was quiet. The translation matrices hummed at the edge of hearing. "If that is what you want," I said, "then you are in the right place." The document was presented by Calith Sorn with the precise, careful manner of someone who has been preparing a specific thing for a long time. It was not a long document. It established a framework, a secondary assembly with full equal representation, voluntary membership open to any willing species, no founding hierarchy, no legacy privilege. Every signatory had one vote. Earth was one signatory among many, not a leader or a host in any formal sense, just one of the species that had decided to start building something different. 19 species signed on the floor. The signatures came in ones and twos across about 2 hours, each species taking the time it needed, reading what it was signing, asking the questions it needed to ask. No one was hurried, no one was pressured. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something that matters is happening and everyone present knows it. By the end of the week, after the transmission of the signed document reached a wider audience, 11 more species had contacted the Aethini to request inclusion. 30 signatories total. The Concordat issued a formal statement describing the secondary assembly as a concerning development and encouraging member species to consider their existing commitments carefully. 7 of the 30 signatories were current Concordat members. They issued a joint response noting that their participation in the secondary assembly was not incompatible with existing Concordat obligations and that they considered the new structure a complement to, rather than a replacement for, existing frameworks. It was a diplomatic response. It was also true. The secondary assembly was not trying to destroy the Concordat. It was simply no longer asking the Concordat's permission to exist. Sorvan requested a meeting on my 3rd day at the station. He came alone, without staff, to the room we were using as an Earth liaison space. It was a plain room with a plain table and 2 chairs, and a window that looked out over one of the station's internal light wells, a long shaft of artificial daylight falling from a source far above. He sat down across from me and he looked at me with those complex, geometric eyes, and for a moment he simply looked, without speaking, in the way that beings sometimes do when they are trying to understand something that does not fit the shape they expected. "You have moved quickly," he said at last. "We were already moving," I said. "We were not permitted to show it." He was quiet. He accepted that. I could see in the quality of his stillness that he had been considering it, probably for some time, the gap between what he had known about Earth and what Earth had turned out to be. The Concordat would reconsider the membership framework, he said. Substantially. The terms would be genuinely different from anything previously offered. I looked at him. A year ago, in a corridor not far from the main chamber, he had looked at me with the ease of someone who does not need to consider the moment carefully. He was considering this moment very carefully. "I will bring it to the council," I said, "but I want you to understand what the conversation is now." I held his eyes. "We are not coming to you asking to be part of what you built. We are inviting you to participate in what we are building. That is not a negotiation from the same position as before. Those are different conversations with different dynamics, and I need you to know that before you decide which one you want to have." He was still for a moment, then he nodded once, one single, precise movement. I poured water for him, because there was a water service on the side table, and I am not cruel, and he had crossed many light years to sit in a plain chair and be honest with me. I offered him the glass and he took it. We spoke for 20 minutes. He asked 3 specific questions about the secondary assembly structure, each of them precise and practical, the questions of someone mapping a situation rather than objecting to it. I answered each one directly. When the 20 minutes were done, he stood, and he inclined his head, and he left. Owen came in from the corridor where he had been waiting. He had not been listening, because I had asked him not to. He looked at me. "What did he say?" Owen asked. "He wants to talk," I said. "He does not yet know which conversation he wants to have." "And us?" Owen said. I thought about it. "We know exactly which conversation we want to have," I said. "That is a significant advantage." He nodded. He looked out the window at the light well, the long shaft of artificial daylight falling through the station's interior. "Are we going home?" he asked. "Tomorrow," I said. "Tonight I want to walk the station." He looked at me. "Walk it?" "The corridors," I said. "The outer ring. Just walk it." "Last time I was here I came to ask for something. I want to know what it feels like to walk through this place when I'm not asking for anything." He understood. He said he would come with me, and we went, just the 2 of us, through the warm marble corridors of Nexus Vale, past the environmental tiers